Good afternoon and welcome to ITIF's event today on the Bayh-Dole Act's role in stimulating university-led regional economic growth. I'm Stephen Ezel. I'm the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today in person or online. So our run of show is that I'm going to make a brief presentation about our new report, turn it over to our all-star panel. We'll have keynote remarks from Representative Deborah Ross at about 1:10 and have audience Q&A. So let me first introduce our panelists before getting into the report. After my presentation, we're first going to hear from Irene Abrams. She is a Senior Vice President of Research Innovation at Boston Children's Hospital, where she leads the Technology and Innovation Development Office, or TIDO, which is responsible for commercializing discoveries and innovations developed by researchers and clinicians at Boston's Children's Hospital. She is also the Managing Director of the hospital's Therapeutic and Medical Device Accelerator. In addition to her work at the hospital, Irene is also the chair-elect of the Association of University Technology Managers, AUTUM, which we'll be hearing more about. After Irene, we're delighted to be joined today by Jonathan Goldman. Jonathan is the director of Quadrant I, which is the Technology Innovation Accelerator at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He has spent more than 20 years helping launch dozens of academic spinouts from universities, helping them raise over $600 million in venture capital. He's worked extensively with NASA, RPE, and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Innovation Crossroads Leadership Council. Last but not least, Dan Leonard is the executive director of We Work for Health, an association which advocates for policies that foster innovation and facilitate the delivery of life-saving and life-enhancing medicines. Dan had previously served as president and CEO for the Association for Accessible Medicines, and before that as president and CEO of the National Pharmaceutical Council. And as we get going with remarks and presentations, let me remind those watching online that you can submit questions via the Slido application, which is found at the bottom of the event page. Okay. So, us here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, we're been ranked the world's leading science and technology policy think tank. And, I've given presentations all around the world about innovation economies, innovation ecosystems, and what really differentiates the United States from any other technology economy in the world is that we have transformed American universities into robust engines of innovation that in turn make incredible downstream contributions to regional and state level and national level economic and employment growth. As this report really lays out in detail, looking deeply at 6 states, Colorado, Delaware, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, and North Carolina, chosen for their industrial and geographic and geopolitical diversity. And we'll talk about how the Bayh-Dole Act really underpins this entire system, but there is no sector in which the role of universities in driving American innovation is more robust than the life sciences. Academic technology transfer has led to 500 life sciences startup in the years 1990 to 2011 alone, and 68% of those startups stayed local. They stayed within 60 miles of the founding university. This is really a crown jewel in America's innovation system. And therefore, it's critical that America sustain robust levels of federal R&D funding that really provide the seed cord that makes this entire cycle of innovation work. So, a little history. If you roll the tape back to the year 1968, then President Johnson asked the Comptroller General of the United States, Elmer Statz, how many drugs had been created by NIH-funded research in the previous 2 decades? So Elmer Statz went and looked at this question and found that not one single new drug had been developed when patents were taken from universities. Universities, companies simply didn't have the incentive to commercialize the federally funded research. And in fact, at the time, less than 5% of the 30,000 inventions, government inventions were licensed non-exclusively. There was just no innovation taking place. And this was the inspiration for Congress to come along in 1980 and pass bipartisan legislation in the Bayh-Dole Act, which gave universities, nonprofits, and small businesses the rights to the IP, the intellectual property generated from federally funded research. The inventor retains ownership and title to subject inventions, which then can be exclusively or non-exclusively licensed to third parties. And in fact, 73% of university IP licenses go to small companies. The Bayh-Dole Act also played a role in decentralizing technology management from the government to the institutions, universities, and entrepreneurs who are making the inventions across the country. And subsequently, it's induced a virtuous cycle of innovation as royalties from licenses are used to reward inventors, fund more R&D, cover technology transfer cost, and build university infrastructure like wet labs for research. So when academics have looked at the impact of the Bayh-Dole Act, they found it's just been truly transformative. As Naomi Hausman wrote in this wonderful paper called University Innovation, Local Economic Growth, and Entrepreneurship, quote, "The sort of large-scale technology transfer from universities that exists today would likely have been impossible without the strengthened property rights standardized across agencies set into law in 1980 with the Bayh-Dole Act. Moreover, long-run employment, payroll per worker, and average establishment size grew more in industries more closely related to innovations produced by a local university or hospital after Bayh-Dole was introduced. And it also contributed to university faculty responding to royalty incentives by producing higher quality innovations." So when you add up the impact of academic technology transfer from 1996 to 2000, we see that it's resulted in over 550,000 invention disclosures, 140,000 patents, and 18,000 new startups formed. And these are companies like Google, Genentech, Cisco, that all flowed out of federally funded university research that were transformed into new knowledge, new startups, and new companies. In total, academic technology transfer over that time frame has contributed to $1 trillion of US GDP and $2 trillion of gross industrial output. And this is why when The Economist looked at the first 2 decades of the Bayh-Dole Act in 2002, it said, quote, "This was possibly the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in America over the past half century. It unlocked all the inventions and discoveries that have been sitting in laboratories made with the help of taxpayers' money. And more than anything, this single policy measure helped to reverse America's precipitous slide into industrial relevance as we face the economic malaise of the late 1970s and early 1980s. So the Bayh-Dole Act is one of the best bipartisan pieces of legislation Congress has ever passed. So as I noted at the outset, the report really wants to dive into these 6 states and uncover how universities are so fundamental to the innovation ecosystem of these states. You know, people will ask, well, why didn't you look at, Silicon Valley or San Diego or Boston? Well, yeah, because these are well-known stories, right? We already know the impact. Annalise Saxon's done great work in those states. We wanted to look at kind of really key states in the U.S. innovation economy, although maybe not the ones that are always thought about as being the tip of the spear in the American innovation system. So what we did with these state profiles in the report was provided an overview of the state technology economy, particularly in the life sciences and the IT sector. Autumn was incredibly nice to open the kimono in their stat database and let us look into data they've collected from 1998 to 2023, showing incredible data about how universities have attracted federal and industry R&D investments, the number of inventions they've disclosed and licenses they've issued. We also looked at the number of USPTO patent grants coming out of universities and the number of startups launched. And each state has 2 to 3 innovation vignettes. I'll just walk briefly through a couple of the state profiles. Colorado, really a great story. Today, the University of Colorado system contributes $20 billion to the state's economy annually. And as you can see in this chart, not only from 1998 to 2023, over that quarter century, have Colorado universities spawned 1,600 patents and over 400 startup companies. Nearly 1/3 of those have arrived since 2018. So we've seen a dramatic kind of uptick in Colorado's innovation economy, especially over the past half decade. Indiana, most people don't realize that on a per GDP basis, Indiana is America's #1 manufacturing economy in the United States. And that's powered by their life sciences. It contributes $95 billion to the state's economy annually. The life sciences sector is Indiana's #1 exporter. Nearly 500 startups have been launched by Indiana universities since 1998. And likewise here as well, we see a dramatic uptick, in this case, of patents awarded to Indiana universities, which have increased sixfold since 1998, but more dramatically since 2018. North Carolina, an amazing story. Research Triangle, one of the crown jewels of regional innovation in America. But this comes out especially of UNC, North Carolina State, University of Charlotte. Since 1958, UNC alone has spawned 786 startup companies. 443 of those still reside in North Carolina, showing that once you're a Tar Heel, you're almost always a Tar Heel, as my colleague Leah Kahn, co-authored the report and recent UNC graduate, can attest to. In total, UNC universities have attracted $33 billion in federal R&D funding over that time, and you see the recent uptick as well. So it's, I think, really important for policymakers to understand that over time, there's been a very linear relationship between the amount and extent of federal R&D funding and the amount of invention that's coming out of American universities. As you can see in this chart, which from 1991 to 2023 tracks the value of total federal and private sector R&D investment going to universities against number of invention disclosures. Historically, until we get into the COVID period, but over time, over this period, every $4.2 million in research funding has on average led to one invention disclosure coming out of an American university. And what this means is that for every fewer $1 we have going to universities for R&D, we're foundationally, fundamentally going to see less innovation in the future. And that's not a world we want to be living in when competition, especially from China, increases more every day across every high-tech sector. Unfortunately, the reality is that federal investment in R&D has been faltering, not just recently, but for some time. In fact, by 2023, as you can see here, we had reached the lowest level of federal R&D funding as a share of GDP than even before Sputnik launched, even before the early 1950s. And even if we draw a shorter period of time here, from 2011 to 2023, even in that time, we experienced an 18% decline in federal funding of R&D, such that by 2023, that share had decreased to just 0.2% of US GDP. Now let's put that in context by comparing this level of federal R&D investment to our OECD peers. We're 27th amongst our OECD peers. This is not good enough. This is not company we want to be in. We want to be in the lead. If we were to play out the proposed Trump budget cuts to science, we would fall to 31st out of 39th in this ranking. So what policy recommendations does this lead us to? First, we must recognize that federal and private sector funding of university research is absolutely foundational to America's innovation system. It's the seed corn that has led to the new industries, the new occupations and jobs that keeps the American economy at the forefront of the world. We have to sustain funding for university research. And we need to reverse the recent cuts to NSF, NIH, DOE, et cetera. I know Congress will bring much of this back, but when you look at the proposed Trump budget for the year ahead, it included 55% budget cuts to the National Science Foundation and 38% to the National Institute of Health. If these investments were sustained, this would, by 2026, place America third behind China and the European Union in federal R&D funding. Not good enough. Beyond the basic science funding, we need to make up for indirect cost cuts with increased NIH funding. As we talked about, the Bayh-Dole Act is really the anchor of this entire ecosystem. And therefore, we have to preserve the Bayh-Dole Act as intended. Some have called for using what are called margin rights provisions within the Bayh-Dole Act to attempt to control the prices of resulting products. These are price-based margin rights. This is not what the margin rights were intended for. Dole and Bayh said, we never intended this mechanism to be used to control the price of any resulting product. Policymakers should refrain from using margin rights provisions in the Bayh-Dole Act. The Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBIR program, is going to be up for reauthorization in September. It's a critical complement to help ensure that the startups that are flowing out of these universities have access to initial capital to build their innovations, to test feasibility, to prototype, et cetera. We've got to continue that critical program. We can also introduce collaborative R&D tax credits. These are tax credits that are favored, like a 20% flat credit when companies directly invest in universities. Finally, at the federal level, we can make innovation and entrepreneurship a stronger consideration for university tenure, help students and faculty to launch their innovations coming out of universities. Finally, at the state level, a few policy recommendations. Many states like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Connecticut have provided matching SBIR funds at to what the federal level does. All states should look at providing similar matching. Some states like Louisiana and Virginia have also introduced their own collaborative R&D tax credits to bring industry and university closer together. And some states have introduced innovation vouchers, small $25,000 to $50,000 grants that go to a company but can only be redeemed at a university to help them build out their new products. So in conclusion, I will just reiterate that the Bayh-Dole Act has been just a foundational driver of this entire ecosystem of university-driven innovation, and policymakers need to be mindful of understanding this history, but also curating a policy environment in which we can continue to reap the benefits of this incredibly powerful innovation system we've developed over the years. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Irene for her remarks.
All right. Thank you, Steve. That was terrific. I love that report and your overview of it. I'm Irene Abrams. I'm the Senior Vice President for Research Innovation at Boston Children's Hospital, and I'm the Autumn Chair-elect. So I'm here largely in my role as Autumn, but I feel like I have to say something personal about the Bayh-Dole Act because I started my career at MIT in their tech transfer office, and don't fall off your chairs. It was in 1989. And as you know, the Bayh-Dole Act was passed in 1980. So I was really there in the early days. And part of the talk today is about regional development based upon innovation in the Bayh-Dole Act. And I know lots of people have studied Massachusetts, but I really lived it. And I saw how when I first got there, Kendall Square was pretty much a bunch of empty warehouses and candy factories. And over time, the work from MIT and from Harvard and the local institutions, the hospitals as well, began to leave, and there were spin-out companies everywhere filling in those warehouses. Incubator companies came, venture capitalists came, lawyers came, who could help support all the entrepreneurial activity. But the amazing thing, and I'm still personally amazed when I go to Kendall Square now, is how many pharmaceutical companies are there. And not just the companies, but they have pharmaceutical campuses, like multiple buildings and campuses. And that all happened from the seeds that started with Bayh-Dole and with the MIT TLO and Harvard spinning out companies and building all of that around it. So it's really an honor for me to be here and talk about this. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Autumn. So Autumn is the professional organization that supports the tech transfer community. And so we really support the practitioners in this field. There are many people doing amazing work on policy, on legislation, but Autumn really represents the folks who practice tech transfer day in and day out. So overall, we're the largest nonprofit organization in tech transfer. We have over 3,000 members worldwide and represent tech transfer offices at over 800 universities, research centers, academic medical centers like Boston Children's Hospital, where I work, and related business and government organizations. And we have a number of pillars at Autumn. Educate, so we try to promote best practices, raise up the next generation of tech transfer professionals. Promote, we do a lot of advocacy for legislation and policies that support innovation. Connect, this one I think is really critical. We're sort of the key convener of the tech transfer community. And finally, include a broad perspective. So I have one slide about Boston Children's Hospital, and I put it in here to give you a little bit of an example of what's happening at one institution in terms of innovation and technology commercialization. And then I'll sort of zoom out to talk about what's going on nationally as well. So Boston Children's Hospital, we're primarily known, like many pediatric hospitals, for our clinical care, but we are also a research powerhouse. So we are, our annual research expenditures are over $500 million a year, which makes us the largest NIH-funded pediatric hospital, but we're also the third largest standalone hospital, adult and pediatric, based upon research size in the nation. My office, which manages the technology transfer operations, we have a lot of partnerships and internal funding for translational research. And in terms of innovations that have come out of Boston Children's, we've had 11 drugs approved, therapeutics that have made it to the market. And I just want to tell you two stories, I'll try to make them quick, about innovations that have come out of Boston Children's. So one is Casgevy, which is the very first CRISPR drug that's ever been approved for human use. It's for sickle cell disease, for severe sickle cell disease. It's being sold by Vertex in partnership with CRISPR Therapeutics. But it came out of years of fundamental research on the development of hemoglobin. There had been a clinical insight years ago that patients who develop sickle cell disease are born healthy. They don't develop their sickle cell until they're a year, maybe almost 2 years old. And so the clinical insight was that there must be a different form, a healthy form of hemoglobin before you're born, and that sort of stays around for a couple of years. And then the adult form, or is the sickled form, the diseased form. And so one of our faculty members, Dr. Stuart Orkin, spent years and years studying the foundation of sickle cell to try to understand what was that switch that turns off fetal hemoglobin, and can you figure out a way to change it? And in fact, he did. Ultimately, working with folks at the Broad Institute and MIT, they came up with a CRISPR technology, which is the guide sequence that's being sold now, that actually reactivates the fetal hemoglobin. It turns off the off switch. And I tell you that story because when I get to a later slide talking about federal funding and industry funding, keep in mind that these discoveries that are out in the market and changing people's lives are based upon years and years and years of fundamental research. The second one I'll talk about is Revlimid, which is a drug for multiple myeloma currently being sold by Bristol Myers Squibb, previously by Celgene. They were acquired by BMS. And that came out of the work of one of the great innovators of Boston Children's Hospital, the late Dr. Judah Folkman. He had the insight, he's a surgeon, he had the insight that if cancer grows, if you have a solid tumor, there must be blood vessels growing as well to feed that tumor. It's called angiogenesis. And he had the insight that if you could block the development of new blood vessels, maybe you could fight cancer and prevent tumor growth. It was called anti-angiogenesis. And he spent many, many years working on this. It took a long time to get acceptance in the community. And now there are many drugs on the market that are based upon this concept of preventing the development of blood vessels. And Revlimid was a subsequent insight that it would work for liquid tumors as well as solid tumors, so for leukemias as well as for solid tumors. And that's one of the most valuable anti-cancer drugs on the market now. And so I'm going to zoom out now and talk more about what's going on nationally and across the world in tech transfer. And I have some new numbers. Our autumn 2024 licensing survey just came out, so hot off the press. And so you can see this is a slide we show a lot to sort of show the cycle of technology transfer and innovation. And so you can see sort of at the top left, there's over 100 billion, which I guess is $1 trillion in research expenditures in 2024. Which has led to over 26,000 new inventions. And you can see those inventions lead to new patents, and the patents then lead to new license agreements. When the technology leaves the institution and goes into private hands, those license agreements and options agreements formalize that transfer of the technology. And that's really where the private industry comes in and starts to develop the products. And you can see many products on the market, and over 950 new startups have been formed. And so Steve mentioned this, but to reiterate it, there's sort of a straight line between funding of research, number of inventions, and number of licenses. And if you continue to fund research, there will be more inventions and more licenses, and it is almost a linear relationship. And so there is a lot of concern in the universities and academic medical centers for sure, but in the innovation community as well. Certainly in Boston, I know the folks who run incubators, the venture capitalists are really nervous, and the pharma companies, not so much yet because it's a little more downstream for them, but they're really thinking hard about what will happen if the beginning of this process really, really shrinks. And then I wanted to show you this slide because I think this is really important, particularly for the moment we're in. And I'm sorry, the graphics are a little funky. But this also is from the most recent autumn survey. And you can see different forms of research funding. So the green line, the top line, is federal funding, which has gone up over time in absolute numbers, if not as percentage of GDP. And then the middle blue line is other forms of funding. These are generally foundations or internal university or hospital funding of research. The bottom line, though, is industry funding. And you can see that over the last 20 years, it hasn't moved very much. And I show you that because a lot of people say, well, you know, if the federal government stops funding research, private industry will step in. And I think you can see it's probably not going to make up that gap, right? Because I think even if we're like incredibly creative and innovative in our own work and we get double industry funding, triple industry funding, we're still nowhere near where the level of federal funding. So I think it's important sort of for two reasons. First, because I think it's unrealistic that industry would fill in for the lack of federal funding. And second, it's not really what industry does. And so if you think about, particularly in the life science where I work, the pharma companies, they fund a lot of research, but it's generally very directed, later stage research, close to the product, aligned with their strategic aims. So if you think about the two stories I told you about Casgevy and about Revlimid, those both came out of years and years, if not decades, of fundamental research, exploratory research that no pharma company would fund. They would never fund somebody to spend 30 years trying to understand the development of hemoglobin or to prove this, at the time, was thought crazy theory about angiogenesis. And so I think it's important as we go through this period, particularly for people who are involved in policy and in government, to understand, well, all of us at academic medical centers are trying to figure out how to bring in more funding and have our funding be more diverse. There's a real gap between the concept of where industry is and where the government is. And let me just conclude with a few take-home messages. So technology transfer is inextricably linked to federal research support. It's reliant on strong and predictable patent protection to commercialize discoveries, part of why the Bayh-Dole Act is so critical to this work. Out of this work have been thousands of products and startup companies, and it's been an enormous driver of GDP and jobs. And we're responsible for the innovative products of tomorrow. So thank you very much. And I think I will hand it off to Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Irene. Thank you, Stephen and ITF. I'm Jonathan Goldman from Georgia Tech. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you today to talk about what we do at Georgia Tech. I think what we want to do is talk more about how things get out of the lab, the process for getting out of the lab, and our role in helping that along. So this is President Cabrera of Georgia Tech. He's came into office in 2019 with his 10-year term. And in 2024, halfway through, he went to his advisors and he said, look, I have dozens and dozens of top initiatives. I want you to skinny that down. And they came back with 17. He said, no, you didn't hear me. Skinny that down. And he wound up with 4 big bets. And you can see on the bottom that big bet number 4 is to have Georgia Tech become a center, a hub for innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship. And so that's what our office is focused on. We're part of the Office of Commercialization. And in that office, there are 4 pillars. One is Venture Lab. Venture Lab is the function that teaches Lean Start method and customer discovery to our students and to the rest of the members of the Southeastern hub of the NSF I-Corps. We have our Office of Technology Licensing run by Mary Albertson, who used to run Autumn. We're very pleased, happy, and blessed to have her. She was 26 years at Stanford. We have CreateX. Now, CreateX is an entrepreneurship training program for the undergrads. They go through a year-long program. They get course credit for it. But the undergrads own their own IP. They're students. They're paying Georgia Tech. They're not employees of the institution. What we focus on at Quadrant I are the professors, grad students, PhDs, postdocs, and research engineers that are employees of the institution, where Georgia Tech owns that intellectual property. And obviously, this is where Bayh-Dole comes into play. These are our clients. These are my customers. And so if you don't know anything about academic innovation, I call it the lunatic fringe of risk. So many things can go wrong in trying to start a company out of the lab. If you don't know, if you're not a cosmologist, you never heard of the Drake equation, which is the probability of finding intelligent life in the universe, which is a tiny number, or if you've watched Big Bang Theory, these are all the things that can go wrong when you're trying to start a company. We, as principals inside Quadrant I, are engaging with faculty in dozens of projects a year with the hope of spinning out somewhere between 3 and 6 incorporated startups. So that's kind of the process. That process will begin with that invention disclosure. Sometimes it begins with an outreach. We have actually a nice software that goes out, scrapes the peer-reviewed journal literature, hashes it against the Georgia Tech directory, and then we each get a custom email with all the abstracts that are in kind of our field of understanding. And then we can reach out and say, I read your paper. This is very interesting. Let's go have coffee. That's how things will get started. But it's the management of the flow through that funnel that requires a portfolio management strategy. You've got professors that are distracted. They're distracted by teaching, research, conferences, papers, managing students. And we find that if we're not in their face all the time, then things stop. And the image I like is this old railroad pumper car. All you have to do is let go and it coasts to a stop almost instantly. And so we partner with them on a multi-year journey, usually shorter for software, generally longer for hard tech or biotech. That's our work, and it's very hands-on with what we do. Now, the term seed corn was used earlier. And so while Bayh-Dole is right there at the top of the funnel, this is our seed corn for help pulling it out of the lab. I-Corps will provide early stage funding to go do the customer discovery. The Georgia Research Alliance is a public-private partnership that provides commercialization grants to help us do commercialization-focused research to push these things along. Biolocity is another source of funding from a private foundation that's targeted at biotech and biomed. All of these non-federal dollars are nonetheless, well, in case of I-Corps it is, but all of these non-pure research dollars are absolutely essential in helping mature these technologies and push them up the technology readiness level, or TRL stack. That's a term that NASA coined, but it's now used by DoD. We have to get that TRL to 6 or 7, and universities typically stop at 4 or 5, and that's your valley of death. And that's why, by the way, that line was flat earlier, is because there's too big of a gap. Industry just doesn't get interested at TRL 6, maybe at 7, because it's close enough to becoming a product that they can then justify that incremental investment to get it to become a product. So that's our charge, is to take stuff that's invented, that's TRL 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5, and then push it the rest of the way. These are just some stats from our licensing office, and I want to draw your attention to just a couple of things. You'll see here GTRI, that's the Georgia Tech Research Institute. That's kind of our MIT Lincoln Labs. So out of last year's $1.5 billion of research funding that Georgia Tech got, $1 billion of it was GTRI. About $500 million was on the academic side. So you can see there's a big disparity here between the 464 disclosures that we receive on the academic side and the 68, because it's the military and they're not necessarily as interested. However, you can see by the percent increase that is changing, because there is more of a recognition of a need and a drive for dual use technologies. So we do expect we're going to be engaging more with GTRI in the future. The other thing to notice is that you see there's 65 techs that are licensed. These are individual IP, individual patents, and 36 licenses. That's just saying that some licenses that go out to startups or industry are portfolios of multiple patents. For our stats at Quadrant I, we look at 4 things. We look at number of new projects that we become engaged in. So you see here, this past year, we were involved in 49 new projects. Overall, there's somewhere between 80 to 90 active projects, because again, several years coming through the funnel. We had 16 incorporations. And then you see here non-dilutive funding, which goes back to the I-Corps and Biolocity and GRA funding, but also the SBIR funding. So the SBIR funding is non-dilutive, and that's very important in helping push the thing the rest of the way. And then the dilutive funding. And what's interesting about that dilutive funding, first of all, the ratio of the non-dilutive to dilutive is important, because you get a big return. And I say return in that 158 million dilutive is a vote of confidence from the market, right, from the investor. You'll notice that in fiscal year 24, we had 442 million, but 375 million was one raise from our unicorn, which is Silent Nanotechnologies, which is a battery technology. So still up more than double from the previous year if you take out the sort of statistical outlier. And I won't spend a lot of time here, but from Stephen's report, you see that between 2000 and 2015, we more than doubled the number of invention disclosures. And then also in that study, there were 4 examples out of Georgia. Blue Earth is a diagnostic dye for treating prostate cancer. And Restasis was the first treatment for chronic dry eye. Synagiva is an enzyme that was engineered for lysome acid lipase deficiency, which is a rare condition. And then Suniva was the company I helped start out of Georgia Tech with Professor Rohatky. I remember sitting with him. There was about 20 patents in his portfolio, and we went through it and said, no, these are 6 or 7 that the company actually needs. And then I helped write the private placement memorandum, the performance for the PPM that helped them raise the $25 million after the first $5 million raise. What I think is important to address, though, everybody love startups. They love to talk about Bayh-Dole in the importance in the life of a startup. It's very exciting to talk about that. But there's another reason there's another reason how Bayh-Dole can move an ecosystem. If you see these icons on the left, these are for companies that have shown up in the metro Atlanta region because of Georgia Tech. Absolix and Micron. Micron is the memory manufacturer. Absolix is a Korean manufacturer of glass panels for new emerging chiplets. Micron showed up with 100 people in a research group that came down to Midtown Atlanta, because both of these companies, for the sake of Georgia Tech Semiconductor Packaging Research Center, which is worldwide known. Archer Aviation is building a plant in Covington, Georgia, to make electric aviation aircraft, so-called UAM, urban air mobility. We have a #1 aerospace school. SK Innovation, there's a battery plant. And then many years ago, Varian bought a company in Atlanta and moved its medical systems there. So these are other reasons why the IP is important. It's not just for startups, but it can attract corporates to come to the area, just as Irene mentioned. And what we hope to move the needle in the Atlanta ecosystem is to see more semiconductor people show up. NVIDIA just gave us $2 million for a makerspace, more pharma coming there, and more AI and machine learning. All three of these are important because they're incredibly high economic multipliers. They're the best kind of jobs you can hope for. So that's our job, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Just advance it one more, so turn it off. Okay.
Great. Yeah, as Stephen mentioned at the top, I'm Dan Leonard. I'm the executive director of We Work for Health, and I'll just mention briefly, We Work for Health. Our mission is to advance and to work that would maintain the United States as the leader in innovation in the life sciences. And we do a lot of work with ITIF, and we love working with them, a great partner to tell the stories just like this one. So there's, in that last slide, Jonathan, that you had is really summarizes a lot of what we want to talk about, or what we talk about every day, which is how innovation then leads to job creation, leads to economic growth in all of these markets that we've talked about, the states that Stephen profiled in this report that wouldn't be top of mind, as Delaware, Colorado, as life science leaders, Indiana, but they certainly are. So we're really pleased to be here. I want to thank ITIF. I want to thank my fellow panelists for spotlighting this important project, this important research, and the importance of the Bayh-Dole Act. And you're all experts on Bayh-Dole already, but by the end of this meeting, you certainly will be able to answer any trivia question that might come your way on Wednesday night trivia about the Bayh-Dole Act and innovation. But we are also at a policy crossroads. We're at a moment in time where the choices that the people in this building and the house next door that they will make can impact this. We've seen a lot of slides, beautiful slides, going in the right direction, going up from left to right on the screen today. We need to keep that trajectory moving. So patents arising from government-supported research should be recognized as a product of a vital partnership. And you've heard about this, the partnership between public funding, academic investment, and academic innovation, and private enterprise. Private enterprise being the companies that will ultimately commercialize products, but also venture capital that needs to come in at really early stages to keep this going. And that's really the key, I think, one of the key underline that I would underline of the messages today is the importance of this partnership between the federal and government sponsors, academic institutions, and private industry. They need to work together, they need to invest together, and they need to innovate together. And this is a story about success. This is a success story of how that has been working. But as I mentioned, we're at a critical time where it could go in the other direction. So I'll hit on that in a moment. But the Bayh-Dole Act is really the cornerstone of American innovation policy. It turned academic discovery into a national economic engine. And I will just say that before the 1980s, before Bayh-Dole Act, I would add to the list the Hatch-Waxman Act, which is important to our sector in life science in 1984. That really created the economic engine that we needed, the innovation engine in this country that has kept us going for many, many years. In fact, we took over the mantle of leader in life science innovation from Europe, which had that position until Bayh-Dole and then Hatch-Waxman and other innovations, and the advent of universities coming in and investing heavily, and tech transfer. All that happened in the 80s. We have owned the mantle of life science leader, innovation leader since the early 90s, late 80s. But we are under threat right now. China is investing heavily in their own life science sector and innovation. I'll touch on that in a moment. So we need to keep that virtuous cycle, as Stephen called it, going between the investment from the government sector and the private sector and the university systems. So I mentioned policy threats. While researchers are delivering promising results, there are also some lawmakers who are actively undermining the system. They don't intend to do that, but some of the proposals that are being put forward would do just that. So I'll mention most favored nation status. This is a proposal that's been getting a lot of mention lately, which would set U.S. drug prices against essentially importing foreign price controls to the United States, which would weaken incentives for innovation and threaten domestic research investment. So that's one. MFN would take us in the wrong direction when it comes to innovation. The Inflation Reduction Act from a few years ago, and particularly a component of the IRA, which is now known as the pill penalty, but one of the unintended consequences of the IRA was setting a different period of time that companies would have for their exclusivity period before they would be subject to government negotiation on price. So small molecule drugs, think your pills and tablets, your predominantly generic medicines, would have 9 years of exclusivity. Biologics, which are typically infused medications or administered by your physician, get 13 years. Well, what's happening is that all of the early investment dollars, think venture capital money, even corporate money, is going toward biologics, and we're truly seeing the bottom drop out of the small molecule market. So investment in what will ultimately be very inexpensive medicines is disappearing. The other thing we're seeing is a shift from investment in treatments to treat the elderly, because the IRA is a Medicare program. So if companies think in 9 or 13 years, I'm going to be under this government negotiation for my medicine, well, I won't invest in Parkinson's, or I won't invest in Alzheimer's. I'm going to go invest in treatments for anxiety and depression, which are typically for younger people. So this is another project that we supported earlier on, but we're seeing those very real examples in the marketplace. So overall, many new policy proposals take us, I would say, in the wrong direction and increase barriers to the commercialization of promising inventions and slowing the tech transfer from critical institutions like the NIH. In the report, in ITIF's report, it emphasizes how innovation benefits states, right? Well, a lot of this are these key states that Stephen highlighted. It's exactly where what putting the risk, that policymakers are instilling here in some of these policies would undermine all of the great things that you're seeing today in these various states and in the universities. I mentioned China, and while we debate whether the weakening of policies that build our innovation economy, China is doing just the opposite right now. They are investing heavily to expand their own internal programs, their own innovation network and systems in the United States. Stephen had that slide that showed the U.S. dropping to 27th out of 39, 27 or 28, I guess, out of 39 OECD countries in federal university funding. Meanwhile, China is pouring investment into its own research infrastructure, and they're watching us closely as we consider, decisions that are made in this building and what that would mean going forward. Policies that actually I would submit, weaken ours. China has already surpassed this. This actually was eye-opening to me because it happened in data I've seen just within the last few months. But China surpassed us last year, 2024, in the number of new clinical trial starts. First time ever that the United States is not first in the world in new clinical trial starts. So, every policy like the ones that I just mentioned that weakens our IP protections or reduces innovation is a gift to China. And I would add to that, not just China. This is just as an anecdote, but I have a friend who's a CEO of a biotech company who was in the Netherlands the day after the NIH, there was a big story, the NIH cuts became big news, and there was a lot of noise around that, and it was kind of a tragic incident, a tragic decision to have these NIH cuts. My friend who's a biotech CEO is in the Netherlands. The very next day, a full-page ad in the newspaper in Amsterdam that the Netherlands will give these grants to U.S. investigators to come over to the Netherlands, and we have all these great properties for you. We have these tech centers for you, and they're actively recruiting our investigators to go to the Netherlands, and that was happening all over the world. But that's a real world story that just happened. So first, what should policymakers do? First, when you're considering legislation, consider these issues that we're talking about today. What is going to happen to innovation in this country? What's going to happen to investment? What's going to happen in your own university systems? Call in the leaders of your own universities in your state and ask them, what would this do at Children's? What would this do to Georgia Tech? Have those conversations. And then, we need to stop harmful proposals in their tracks. So I would start with the MFN because it's been getting a lot of attention this year. Let's really dig into what the real world impacts would be of that legislation. Second, Congress should pass legislation that advances innovation or fixes some things that are taking us in the wrong direction. I mentioned the pill penalty, which is part of the IRA. The EPIC Act has been introduced in both the House and the Senate, and I would, it was under some strong consideration earlier in the year before the reconciliation package. I hope it's considered to come back in the second half of this year as we consider potentially a health package. But the EPIC Act would simply take the 9-year to 13-year discrepancy between small molecule and biologic medicines and equalize them at 13 years. So you won't have this dichotomy, and you won't have small molecule drugs really getting underproduced, under-investigated, et cetera. Thirdly, we need to protect and modernize the Bayh-Dole framework, guarding against abuse of march-in rights, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit more, but making sure that we maintain strong IP enforcement in this country. So I'll conclude by saying thank you again to ITIF. The report, really celebrates the successes. We've heard some great real-world stories of how an idea and a lot of hard work over many years or decades can lead to cures and treatments that are changing people's lives. But we need to keep that moving. We can either preserve and strengthen the policies that made America the global innovation leader, or we can watch others fill that vacuum that would be created if we move in the wrong direction. America's patients, workers, communities, students, they all deserve the system that we built for them, and we ought not take it down. So thank you very much.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for those wonderful remarks. I want to remind folks watching online that we will take your questions via the Slido app and want you in the room to be getting your questions ready. I've got a couple prepared questions for our panel, but we'll take your questions right after that. So get your queries all lined up. So in March of this year, Nature magazine conducted a poll of more than 1,200 researchers at American universities and institutions, of whom 75% said they were thinking of leaving. Separately, The Economist estimates that if the proposed aforementioned budget cuts to NSF and to NIH were to come through, more than 80,000 American researchers could lose their jobs. And of course, Dan talked about how countries like France and Holland now have programs in place designed specifically to, attract American researchers who, may have to leave in this budgetary environment. My question is, are you seeing evidence of this at your universities? How serious of a challenge is this? How much damage could this do to our innovation system?
I'll jump in. So at Boston Children's, we are definitely seeing our faculty being actively recruited by folks overseas, and it started sort of right away around the time that you said, right when they started to talk about reducing the IDC rate, and then the proposed cuts to the NIH budget. So we've been actively countering, trying to figure out a way to keep our faculty. But I have to say, I have some sympathy for them, because if you're told, if your life's work is a certain form of research and you're told there won't be funding for it anymore, that would be very difficult to stay in the institution and not be able to continue your work. I think the other real risk to the economy are students, and the graduate students and postdocs and undergrads from overseas who come here and study. Certainly, graduate students are not coming. They're changing their mind if they were going to come from overseas. And postdocs, a lot of them are staying in their home countries or taking other opportunities. And some graduate students have had their offers revoked because the universities and labs aren't sure they would have their funding. So there's sort of the impact on the faculty today, but there's sort of a potential longer term impact on the ecosystem if we don't have people coming in.
So, is this on? Yeah. Okay.
There you go, brother.
So not directly professors, but actually students, undergrads. We have a program that we started 5 semesters ago called Entrepreneurship Assistant. So you have a GRA, Graduate Research Assistant, TA. Now you can have an Entrepreneurship Assistant. We take these students, we give them 3 90-minute sessions to learn how to do customer discovery, and then we connect them, because of their background, to a project, because organizing, arranging, and scheduling these customer discovery interviews is a heavy lift, and the professors or even their PhD students don't have time. Wildly popular. We're doing 20, 25 students in a semester. We had to freeze it this fall. We don't have the funds to do it this fall. And that's really sad, because I'm getting pinged every other day by students, hey, what's up with the fall program? And we just had to say, sorry, it's on hiatus right now.
I mentioned the anecdote that I had about the Netherlands, and you mentioned France, Stephen. So we know that this is active, that there's active recruiting. I also mentioned, China has advanced their work, and certainly they're incentivizing, they're investing, they're prioritizing this type of work in their country. But there's also, the other thing going on in China. The cost of doing these trials is much less expensive. So if you're seeking to investigate a drug or commercialize a drug, that there is a dichotomy in the price. It's cheaper to do in China, and their labs have gotten better. So it's real competition that our investigators at our universities face over there as well. So I'd just add that to the conversation.
Just to emphasize on your point about China, Dan, in 2006, China accounted for 2% of global oncology clinical drug trials. Today, that's at 20%. China's share of global value added in the pharmaceutical industry has increased 4-fold over the past 25 years. And you referenced the point about initial new drug filings globally, but even in the United States last year, 35% of initial new drug applications were from US companies, 30% were from China. So it's not just that it's globally, it's here in the United States. So the China life sciences challenge is very real, and policymakers need to be mindful of that. Much of this report, Jonathan wanted to focus on, what's happening at universities to stimulate and accelerate innovation. And, one point the report makes is that now nearly 40% of US universities have a formal, innovation incubator or accelerator attached to them, some entity within the university that's helping faculty or students, kind of launch new innovations, new products. Could you maybe just talk? One thing also interesting was that Purdue, when we interviewed them, talked about a deliberate pro-innovation culture shift across the university, led top down. You talked about that at Georgia Tech. What are some of the best practices we're seeing at American universities these days to really amplify this innovation effect?
Well, I think what you're seeing, so I would make a distinction a little bit between incubators and accelerators. Incubators typically are a real estate play. The accelerator is generally a program that's somewhat time bound, right? It's some weeks or some months. Y Combinator is a good example of that. And so we're seeing more of those programmatic effects because that's thought to help accelerate the innovation. But I do think there are other approaches. One thing, so to say it's a best practice, we haven't done it yet, but we have an eye to do it once we can raise the philanthropic funding. There's a national program called Activate, which gives PhDs the opportunity to compete for $200,000, which will basically give them 2 years of runway and pays for their health care for them to focus on their startup based on their PhD. We would like to do something similar, probably not quite as rich as that, but the notion is that they defend their thesis, and then for the next 12 or 18 months, they're going to do nothing but work on that startup, obviously with our help, but it's a way to get them to focus and potentially, shunt them from just jumping into industry where there's a more immediate reward, but this is a way to let them focus on the last 5 years of their life. And so that's one thing we want to do. I mentioned the entrepreneurship assistance, but candidly, I think the most important thing that a university can do is surround itself with a cadre of committed volunteers, of later stage folks that either have exited a startup or are in between, where they can donate their time and help bring reality to some of these projects, because the students don't have that history, they don't have that experience in an industry, and that's what's necessary to turn a technology into a solution or a product.
So Dan, we talked about how the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act gave universities the ability to license the intellectual property that results from federally funded research activity at universities and then spin that out to startups or small companies, and how the legislation included march-in rights. This would be the ability of the government to go in and to essentially reclaim ownership to that IP, or at least mandate that the IP could be licensed to other entities. Could you talk about why Congress included those march-in rights originally, and what are the limited cases which they were intended for, and why they don't pertain to the price of a product that would result from this innovation process?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I would add this to the list of bad policy, potentially. Not the implementation of march-in, if there were a break glass moment where the government went in and literally seized the patents, and this is what this would be ripping up the contracts that they had with the universities and seizing those patents and then taking them back away from the companies and those that were selling these medications, in this case, selling the drugs. The reason for including it at all was really for health catastrophes, or a situation where there was no treatment on the market. So there's zero treatment, then a health crisis comes forward and you need access to a medication in a crisis situation. The government does have the ability to march in and take that and use it for public health purposes. What's changed recently is there have been some policymakers who think that crisis is a crisis of price, and that drug prices are too high, and therefore the government has the right to go in and seize that patent and sell or give away that medication that came through this process that we're speaking to here today. So, I think it's they weren't wrong in the original language to insert this break glass option into the bill, but it's the how it would be used is very much up for debate, and using price as a trigger would not be an effective use of that, and it would cause a traumatic chilling effect on future investors, on future companies that would want to commercialize the treatments coming out of our amazing university system in this country. So it is something that we heard about some in the last administration. It was not exercised. It was a threat, but it was not exercised. We would just simply say it's there for a health crisis, but not for anything other than that.
Yeah, and Bayh and Dole talked about it. They were really including the Marching mechanism to ensure that the licensee was actually taking reasonable steps to go ahead and commercialize that license within a reasonable time. And the term reasonable time, some advocates have tried to conflate with the reasonable price over the years. Let me ask if we have any questions from our audience. If so, please raise your hand and say who you're with. We have one here. Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rachel Gray. I'm with NSBA. Thank you to ITIF for all the great work that you do and all the great work that the panelists do. I have a question about whether either ITIF has anecdotal evidence or whether any of the panelists have evidence of certain like Bayh-Dole reporting requirements being an impediment to innovation, particularly small company innovation.
I don't think this is exactly what you asked, but I know, for example, I've been now on 5 ARPA-E programs, so totaling about $15, $17 million. They demand that every quarterly report that the performer has to list any inventions that were disclosed. But the good news is they'll pay for them. So our licensing office loves that because they don't have to go out of pocket for new IP that's disclosed.
From the academic institution side, the reporting requirements have increased quite significantly over the last period of time. I'm not as familiar with the small company issues, but that's definitely true for the academic institutions.
That was definitely a theme when we had discussions with universities, that they were having to allocate ever more resources for reporting compliance, not just with Bayh-Dole, but with SBIR and other federal programs they might engage with. So certainly, streamlining to the maximum extent possible companies and universities' engagements with federal programs makes a lot of sense. Let's go ahead with your question.
Society.
We'll have a mic for you.
Appreciate it. Over the past couple months, a joint associations group featuring APLU, NACUBO, AC, et cetera, have worked together to create a new quote-unquote fair model for federal research funding reform. I'm wondering if the panelists have any comments on how that proposal might impact the commercialization process, as well as just general thoughts on how that might affect universities.
I'm happy to address that. My boss, Nancy Andrews, who's the CSO at Boston Children's, is on that panel. I think fundamentally the idea is that there's a recognition among that group that research has real costs, that the IDC rate covers real costs, and if there's a different model of funding, the academic institutions need to be made whole for the cost of the research. So I think there may be some institutions that come out a little bit ahead and some a little bit behind, but I think the hope is that even within a new model, that the true cost of the research to the academic institution will be covered. I don't think it will negatively impact innovation if the first part of that statement ends up being true, and actually the research and the services that the overhead covers, some of which is the kind of work that we do, is still part of the story.
A question from online. If federal funding is dramatically reduced, should academic entities consider changing their approach to the restrictive terms in industry-sponsored research?
I'm not sure I understand what's being referenced by those terms. The terms, as I understand them, are actually pretty simple. what's yours is yours, what's mine is mine, and what's jointly conceived is jointly owned, which to me is eminently fair. What I do think universities tend to get a bad rap for is just the difficulty in getting business done with them. So I think that there can be lots of innovation around how you can streamline that contracting process to make it quicker and simpler for the industry partner.
You know, one interesting point is I understand some states like Ohio have developed like model university technology licensing agreements across the state universities to streamline the process and make it more standard when there's those types of industry university research contracts going on. You know, maybe it's a good time to ask, there's legislation floating around Capitol Hill on a couple important programs. We mentioned the SBIR program, which needs to be reauthorized by this September. And of course, what that is a federal program that pertains to 11 federal agencies to set aside about 3.2% of intramural R&D funding to go specifically to small businesses. Congress is also interested that the innovations that come out of this university licensing process are manufactured substantially to the maximum extent possible in the United States. And that is represented in the Invent Here, Make Here Act that is currently being circulated across both chambers of Congress. Any perspectives on how policymakers can get both of those pieces of legislation right, particularly how the Invent Here and Make Here Act can balance the interest of trying to ensure that we're always manufacturing these products in the United States against the reality that U.S. manufacturing has been eviscerated. And in a lot of cases, companies do have to go overseas because they can't find the manufacturing partner they need here in the United States.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the U.S. manufacturing. So in the Bayh-Dole Act, there's a requirement that if a product had federal funding, that it is substantially manufactured in the U.S. That is for U.S. sales. And in my experience, most of the time that works out. There have been a few times in my career where I've worked with a company to get a waiver to that. And Autumn just did a survey, and I can't remember, Steve, the actual number, but we did a survey of our members to see how many have requested manufacturing waivers and more about the experience. And it was quite a small number. I don't remember the exact number, but certainly at Children's Hospital, we have gotten one waiver historically, and this was a technology that was almost a byproduct of something that was developed in Europe. And so they had the pharma company had a factory in Europe, and they were producing one product, which was not ours. And the product that was ours was made by a byproduct of that first manufacturing. And so we did get a waiver. But it's pretty rare that universities ask for the waiver, but it's only when you really cannot find a way to manufacture it.
Great, thanks for that response. Did you finish your thought
I think
there?
that was mostly it, is that it's pretty rare, and there is already a process in place where you need to go to where the academic institution has to go to the actual funding agency to request a waiver. So it's a pretty significant burden. And so I think for the folks in the legislature who are thinking about whether it's too easy, it's actually quite challenging to get a waiver and requires a lot of work and effort. So there's a lot of friction. It's not a simple thing to do.
Two quick things. First of all, I think SBIRs are incredibly important, as I mentioned earlier, for helping these startups cross that valley of death. I would say that if the process of review and contract negotiation was streamlined, that would make it even more attractive to those startups. The second thing having to do with supply chains, I just think it's important. If you look at energy companies, they tend to cost a lot of money to scale, to get to pilot scale. And having a program like the Loan Guarantee Office, everybody talks about Solyndra, but that really speaks to the diligence of that technology, not the underlying value of having those loan guarantees. Can help speed these technologies to market, especially when they need to scale to such a size.
Can I make 2 quick points, Stephen? First is we ought not, if the goal is to repatriate or to grow more manufacturing in this country, we ought not have policy that does that has the contrary effect of driving some of this research out of this country. So we talked about how the other countries are actively recruiting our researchers because of the NIH cuts. Well, if we're seeing an exodus of our excellent researchers, then your policies are fighting against each other. So we ought to avoid that. Second thing is, I think one of the keys is in your report, in that we found that some large percentage, and you'll tell me, Stephen, stay within or you're very close to the academic university center where the work was done. So
68% of the life sciences sector.
68%. So let's keep 68% and growing in Research Triangle, right? So that's another answer is get the universities to get the funding to initiate the programs, and the companies will follow.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, we are delighted to have with us this afternoon Representative Deborah Ross, who is currently in her 3rd term serving the 2nd District of North Carolina. She serves also on the House Judiciary Committee and the House Committee on Space, Science, and Technology. She is also a member of the House Democrats Leadership Team, serving as a Chief Deputy Whip and on the Steering and Policy Committee. She is a tireless advocate for equity, justice, progress, and innovation. Thank you for being with us today, Representative Ross.
I kind of wish I had listened to the whole panel. I agree with everything that you all said after I got in, and thank you for accommodating my schedule. It's now even more compressed since we're getting out of town. Thank you so much to ITIF for bringing us together and for hosting this important event, and I hope you've all had a very productive day. Today's conversation focuses on something I witness every single day: the impact that the Bayh-Dole Act has had in driving economic growth through research. In North Carolina, we see how it continues to shape our economy by helping us move ideas from the lab into the marketplace. I'm proud to represent North Carolina's Research Triangle. I represent the NC State part, go Pack, where universities, startups, and major institutions are constantly pushing the boundaries of what is possible. By ensuring that innovation created with federal funding can earn patent protection, Bayh-Dole turns federally funded research into real-world solutions, creating jobs, building companies, and making a difference in people's lives. This one piece of legislation has opened the door for greater public-private partnerships, more startups, and more job creation. Critically for my state, it also allowed regions like the Triangle to compete globally by building innovation ecosystems around our universities, like what you were just referencing. And I see that every single day. In Congress, I serve on the Courts and Intellectual Property Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee. I also serve on the Immigration Subcommittee, and I completely agree with what you've been saying about foreign talent. Strengthening our innovation system has been one of my top priorities my entire career, including as a state legislator and as a university professor. I recently introduced the Leadership in Critical and Emerging Technologies Act. This bill would encourage innovation in cutting-edge technology by requiring the USPTO to create a pilot program to streamline the evaluation of patents in AI, quantum computing, and semiconductors, all needed in this country yesterday. We need to keep pushing forward and supporting policies that turn research into results and make sure every region has the tools to grow its innovation economy. That's why I was proud to lead the House in passing the Unleashing American Innovators Act, which is now law. Obviously, bipartisan, bicameral legislation. I do a lot of work with Senator Tillis on this since we're both from North Carolina. This bill opens the door for first-time patent applicants, funds outreach in underserved areas, and expands the USPTO's presence, particularly in the Southeast, a new office in Atlanta. We wanted it in North Carolina, but that's okay. Atlanta's not far. Finally, we need to protect critical programs like Bayh-Dole. And that's why I joined a number of my colleagues from both sides of the aisle in sending a letter last year raising concerns about proposed changes to how march-in rights could be used under Bayh-Dole. At a time when it can feel like bipartisanship is in short supply, particularly this week, the IP space stands out. There's real momentum and there's real agreement. And I think it is because people understand what's at stake. It's our competitiveness, our economy, and our ability to keep leading the world in innovation. And I always go back to this. Intellectual property is in the Constitution. Our founders were innovators, inventors, creators. They didn't want their intellectual property owned by King George. So they created very, very strong intellectual property protections. This was even before the Bill of Rights. And when I think about intellectual property, I think about it the same way as I think about land and other kinds of property. It is what makes people have that foundation to be able to be creative, be innovative, and then be able to capitalize on their creativity. And we are very unique in this world for protecting and encouraging innovators. And we need more policies coming out of Congress and coming out of the states to do just that. So please know that I will continue to be your partner in Congress, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. The work you are doing strengthens American leadership in research, technology, and entrepreneurship. It is the work of the future. Thank you so much.
We have time for one question. Is there any questions for the representative? If not, I have one. So my question, obviously, there are so many imperatives before our country and the budget, funding defense, funding security, funding health, Medicaid. How do you communicate to policymakers on the Hill how vitally important investment in science and research funding is? How can we best communicate that message that amongst all these other priorities that has to be near the top?
I think that the best way to do it is in a very grassroots way, to have members of Congress see the fruits of that investment in their districts. And, you were talking about energy grants and things like that. And, I know they always bring up Solyndra. We had a hearing on energy grants. By the end of the hearing, because everybody who testified, even the folks who were brought in from the majority side, testified saying there is no energy future in this country without preserving those energy grants. We wouldn't have had the Vogtle projects in Georgia, nuclear, without those grants. We're not going to have fusion technology. We're not going to have hydrogen technology without those grants. So, every bank does a bad loan. Shut up about Solyndra, learn from it, and talk about how we are going to have energy grants for the future because we have an increased energy demand. Bipartisan by the end of that hearing. And it was chaired by a Republican who was skeptical in the beginning. But we've got to tell that story, and we've got to show them the jobs that it creates and really paint that picture for the future. So that's my 2 cents. In North Carolina, most of the renewable energy projects are in rural areas, and they're bringing jobs and economic opportunities to rural areas that didn't exist before. And that's why it's been such a bipartisan issue in North Carolina. So, okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, listen, with that, I think it's a great place to end the discussion. And I should emphasize that that's exactly what we were trying to do in this report as the representative said, to tell the stories of how Bayh-Dole has led to university-driven innovation in these key states across the country and really communicate that in a compelling way. I want to again thank my co-authors of the report, Leah Can and Megan Ostertag. Thank you for the great collaboration. I want to note for those watching online that and those here in the audience that the video will be published and you can share with your colleagues afterwards for further viewing. And with that, I would like to ask you all to join me in thanking our wonderful panel today. Thank you for being here.